the expert. The diary, the summer of 1923, hung heavy over St. Augustine, like a damp blanket, the ancient city's cobblestone streets shimmering with heat waves that made the Spanish colonial buildings dance in the afternoon sun. 5 children stood at the edge of Cordova Street, their bare feet shuffling nervously on the worn stones as they stared at the imposing structure before them. The Ramirez mansion had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its once pristine white walls now stained with mildew and decay. Wrought iron balconies sagged under the weight of creeping vines, and shutters hung askew like broken wings. The locals whispered that old Don Ramirez had died under mysterious circumstances, and that his spirit still wandered the empty halls, searching for something he'd lost in life. "Idari you, Tommy," said Margaret O'Sullivan, her freckled face set with determination. At 12, she was the unofficial leader of their little group, her red hair catching the sunlight like flames. "I dare you to go inside and bring back something to prove you were there." Tommy Brennan, a lanky boy of 11, with dirt-stained knees and a gap-toothed grin, swallowed hard. He'd been the one boasting about his courage just moments before, claiming he wasn't afraid of any old ghost story. Now, faced with the reality of the dare, his bravado was quickly evaporating. "That's easy," he said, though his voice cracked slightly. "Any of us could do that." "Then why don't you?" challenged James Fletcher, the youngest of the group at 9 years old. Despite his age, James had a sharp wit and wasn't easily intimidated. His dark eyes gleamed with mischief as he pushed his wire-rimmed spectacles up his nose. Standing beside James were the Kowalski twins, Peter and Paul, identical boys of 10, who rarely spoke but seemed to communicate through glances and subtle gestures. They watched the exchange with matching expressions of curiosity, their blonde hair bleached almost white by the Florida sun. The mansion loomed before them, 3 stories of Gothic revival architecture that seemed out of place among St. Augustine's Spanish influences. It had been built by Don Ramirez's father in the Leo Tusachenteicet, a testament to the family's wealth from their shipping business. Now it stood as a monument to decay, its grandeur faded and its secrets locked behind boarded windows and a rusted iron gate. "The gate's not even locked," Margaret observed, pointing to where the heavy chain had fallen away from the posts. "Someone's been here recently." Tommy felt his stomach lurch. The idea of ghosts was frightening enough, but the possibility of encountering actual trespassers, perhaps vagrants or criminals, was somehow worse. Still, he couldn't back down now, not with 4 pairs of eyes watching his every move. "Fine," he said, straightening his shoulder.
"I'll go in."
"Grab something and be back before you can count to 100. "Make it 200, Margaret said with a grin. "And it has to be something from inside the house, not just the yard." The wrought iron gate creaked ominously as Tommy pushed it open, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings like a warning. The front garden, once meticulously maintained, had become a jungle of overgrown oleander and wild jasmine. Spanish moss drapes from the ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and somewhere in the tangle of vegetation, something rustled and scurried away. Tommy's friends watched from the safety of the street as he made his way up the cracked marble steps to the front door. The massive wooden portal was adorned with intricate carvings of ships and sea creatures, a nod to the Ramirez family's maritime fortune. The brass doorknob, green with verdigris, turned easily in his hand. "It's unlocked," he called back, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then go in," Margaret shouted, though she made no move to follow. The door swung open with a prolonged groan, revealing a foyer shrouded in darkness. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that followed Tommy inside, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew, and something else, something sweet and cloying, that made his nose wrinkle. The interior of the mansion was a study in faded elegance. A grand staircase curved upward into shadow, its mahogany banister carved with the same maritime motifs as the front door. Crystal chandelier hung like frozen waterfalls from the coffer ceiling, their prisms casting rainbow fragments across the peeling wallpaper. Tommy's footsteps echoed in the vast space as he ventured deeper into the house. To his left, an archway led to what had once been a formal parlor. Furniture sat beneath white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow his movement. He needed to find something small and portable, something that would prove he'd been inside without being too valuable to take. On a table near the window he spotted a small silver letter opener, shaped like a miniature sword. It was tarnished but still recognizable, and it would fit easily in his pocket. As Tommy reached for the letter opener, a floorboard creaked somewhere above him. A froze, his hand suspended in midair. Listening intently, the sound came again, a slow, deliberate footstep, as if someone was walking carefully across the floor of the room directly overhead. His heart hammering against his ribs, Tommy grabbed the letter opener and turned toward the door. But as he did, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. In the dusty mirror above the mantelpiece, he could see the reflection of the staircase behind him. And there, on the landing halfway up, stood a dark figure. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what appeared to be a long coat or cloak. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Tommy could feel its gaze boring into him like ice picks. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither moved. Then the figure raised one arm, pointing directly at Tommy's reflection in the mirror. Tommy didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the door, his feet slipping on the marble floor in his haste. Behind him, he heard the sound of footsteps, not the slow, measured pace from before, but rapid, pursuing steps that seemed to be gaining on him with each stride. Tommy burst through the front door of the mansion like a cannonball, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. The letter opener, clutched in his sweaty palm, caught the sunlight as he stumbled down the marble steps, nearly tripping over his own feet in his desperate flight. "Tommy," Margaret called out, alarmed by his obvious panic. "What happened? What did you see?" But Tommy couldn't speak. He crashed through the iron gate and didn't stop running until he reached his friends, where he collapsed against the stone wall of the neighboring building, gasping for breath. His chest heaved as he tried to form words, pointing back at the mansion with a trembling finger. "There's someone in there," he finally managed to wheeze. I saw them in the mirror. They were watching me. James adjusted his spectacles and peered at the mansion's facade. "Are you sure it wasn't just your imagination? Old houses can play tricks on your eyes." "I know what I saw," Tommy snapped, his fear making him defensive. "There was a figure on the staircase, dressed in black. It pointed at me. The Kowalski twins exchanged one of their silent communications, their identical blue eyes reflecting the same mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Peter, or perhaps it was Paul, finally spoke up. "Did you get something to prove you were inside?" Tommy held up the tarnished letter opener, its blade catching the light. "I got this from the parlor, but I'm telling you, we need to leave. Now." Margaret, however, was not so easily deterred. Her green eyes sparkled with a combination of excitement and determination that her friends had learned to recognize, and fear. If there really is someone in there, we should investigate. What if it's just a vagrant who's taken shelter? We could help them. Or what if it's the ghost of Don Ramirez? James added, though his tone suggested he was more intrigued than frightened by the possibility. "Ghosts don't exist," Margaret declared with the confidence of youth. "There's a logical explanation for everything." Tommy saw shadows, reflections, maybe even someone who has a legitimate reason to be there. Tommy shook his head vigorously. "I'm not going back in there." You didn't see what I saw. The way it moved, the way it looked at me. It wasn't natural. But even as I spoke, Tommy found his gaze drawn back to the mansion. Despite his terror, there was something compelling about the experience, something that made him want to understand what he'd encountered. The rational part of his mind agreed with Margaret. There had to be a logical explanation. But the primal part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive in the face of genuine danger, screamed warnings he couldn't ignore. "Look," Margaret said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when she was determined to get her way. "We don't all have to go inside, but we could at least get closer, maybe peer through the windows. If Tommy really did see someone, we should be able to spot them from outside." The twins nodded in unison, apparently convinced by Margaret's logic. James, ever the scholar, was already formulating theories about what Tommy might have witnessed. Only Tommy himself remained adamant about staying away from the mansion. "You're all crazy," he muttered, but he made no move to leave. Despite his fear, he couldn't abandon his friends to face whatever lurked within those walls. Margaret took charge, as she always did. "We'll approach from the side, where those overgrown bushes can give us cover. If we see anything suspicious, we'll leave immediately and tell the authorities." The group moved as one, creeping along the perimeter of the mansion's ground. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows that seemed to reach out from the building, like grasping fingers. The air was still and humid, heavy with the scent of jasmine and the underlying mustiness that seemed to emanate from the old house itself. As they drew closer to the side of the building, they could see that several of the first-floor windows had been boarded up, but others remained intact, their glass clouded with years of neglect. Margaret motioned for the others to stay low as she approached the nearest window, rising slowly to peer through the grimy pane. The room beyond was what had once been a library, its walls lined with empty bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Dust-covered furniture sat in disarray, and cobwebs draped us at the corners like nature's own curtains. But the room appeared to be empty of any human presence. "Nothing here," Margaret whispered, moving to the next window. This one looked into what might have been a dining room. A massive table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs that stood like silent sentinels. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dulled with dust and age. Again, the room appeared deserted. It was James who spotted it first. As Margaret moved to the third window, he caught sight of movement in one of the second-floor windows. A shadow passed across the glass, too quick and too deliberate to be a trick of the light. "There," he said, pointing upward, "second floor, third window from the left." All five children looked up in time to see the shadow pass by again, this time more slowly, as if whatever cast it was deliberately making itself known. The figure appeared to pause at the window, and for a heart-stopping moment, they could see the outline of a head and shoulders silhouetted against the dim interior light. "It's watching us," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure at the window remained motionless for several seconds, then slowly raised one arm in what could have been a wave or a warning. The gesture was deliberate and unmistakably directed at the children below. Tommy felt vindicated and terrified in equal measure. "I told you," he said, his voice cracking. "I told you there was someone in there." But Margaret was not ready to concede defeat. "It could still be a person," she insisted, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Maybe someone who's been living there illegally. We should hear." Her words were cut off by the sound of the front door opening. The heavy wooden portal swung wide with the same prolonged groan Tommy had heard earlier, but now it seemed amplified in the stillness of the afternoon. The children crouched lower behind the oleander bushes, their hearts pounding as they waited to see what would emerge. For a long moment, nothing happened. The doorway remained empty, a rectangle of darkness that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Then, slowly, a figure began to take shape in the shadows. The figure that emerged from the mansion's doorway was unlike anything the children had expected. Tall and gaunt, it moved with an odd, gliding motion that seemed to barely disturb the air around it. The long, dark coat Tommy had glimpsed in the mirror was revealed to be a formal frock coat of a style that had been fashionable decades earlier. The figure's face remained hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, but its posture suggested someone of advanced age and considerable authority.
And
Margaret felt her breath
catch in her throat.
This was no vagrant or trespasser. The figure's bearing and dress suggested someone of means and education. But what was such a person doing in an abandoned mansion, and why did their very presence seem to chill the air around them? The figure paused at the top of the marble steps, its head turning slowly from side to side, as if scanning the grounds. When its gaze passed over the oleander bushes where the children hid, they all felt a collective shiver run down their spines. It was as if those hidden eyes could see through the foliage and into their very souls. James, ever the observer, noticed details that the others missed. The figure cast no shadow despite the bright afternoon sun, and the dust that swirled around the mansion's entrance seemed to part around it rather than settling on its dark clothing. Most unsettling of all, the figure's breathing, if it was breathing at all, produced no visible vapor in the humid Florida air. "We need to leave," Tommy whispered hurriedly. "Now." But before any of them could move, the figure spoke. Its voice carried across the distance between them, cultured and precise, with the faint trace of a Spanish accent. "Children," it said, the single word somehow conveying both authority and invitation. "There is no need to hide. I have been expecting you." The 5 friends exchanged terrified glances. How could this stranger have been expecting them? They had made the decision to explore the mansion on a whim, driven by nothing more than childhood curiosity and the thrill of a dare. Margaret, despite her fear, felt compelled to respond. Her natural leadership instincts watered with every survival instinct she possessed. But in the end, her curiosity won out. Slowly she rose from behind the bushes, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We're sorry for trespassing," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "We didn't know anyone was living here." The figure's head tilted slightly, and though they couldn't see its face, the children sensed amusement in the gesture. "Living," it repeated, the word carrying an odd emphasis. "I suppose that is one way to describe my residence here." James stood up next, his analytical mind working furiously to process what he was witnessing. "Are you the caretaker of the property?" he asked, adjusting his spectacles nervously. In a manner of speaking, the figure replied, "I am Don Eduardo Ramirez, and this has been my family's home for many years. Though I must confess, it has been some time since I've had visitors." The children's blood ran cold. Don Eduardo Ramirez had died in 19... They all knew the story. The wealthy shipping magnate had been found dead in his study under mysterious circumstances, his body discovered by servants who claimed he appeared to have aged decades in a single night. Tommy found his voice first. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Don Ramirez is dead. Everyone knows that." The figure who claimed to be Don Ramirez descended the marble steps with that same gliding motion, each footfall silent on the stone. As he drew closer, the children could see more details of his appearance, and what they saw only deepened their terror. His skin was pale as parchment and seemed to have a translucent quality, as if light passed through it rather than reflecting off its surface. His hands, which emerged from the sleeves of his coat, were long and thin, with fingers that appeared almost skeletal. Most disturbing of all, when he finally raised his head enough for them to glimpse his face beneath the hat's brim, they saw eyes that held no warmth, no life, just an endless dark depth that seemed to pull at their very souls. "Death," he said conversationally, "is a relative concept. Ye have learned that there are many ways to exist, many states of being that the living cannot comprehend." Peter and Paul Kowalski, who had remained silent throughout the encounter, suddenly broke and their identical blonde heads disappeared around the corner of the neighboring building, their footsteps echoing off the cobblestones as they fled toward the safety of the main thoroughfare. Don Ramirez watched them go with what might have been sadness. Fear, he murmured, always fear. It has been my constant companion these many years. Margaret, despite every instinct screaming at her to follow the twins, stood her ground. What do you want? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Want? Don Ramirez seemed to consider the question carefully. I want many things, child. I want to feel the warmth of the sun on my skin again. I want to taste food and wine, to hear music and laughter, feel these empty halls. I want to sleep without dreams and wake without the weight of eternity pressing down upon me. He paused, his dark gaze fixing on each of the remaining children in turn. But most of all, I want to understand why I remain when others have passed on, why I am trapped in this existence between life and death, neither fully one nor the other. James, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing, stepped forward slightly. You're saying you're a ghost? Ghost? Don Ramirez repeated the word as if tasting it. Such a crude term for something so complex. I am unfinished. There is something that binds me to this place, some task left undone or wrong left unrighted. Until I discover what that is, I am condemned to wander these halls, watching the world change around me while I remain constant. Tommy, who had been edging slowly toward the street, suddenly stopped. Despite his terror, something in the figure's words resonated with him. How long have you been like this? Time has little meaning for one such as I. Don Ramirez replied, but by your reckoning, it has been 9 years since my body failed me. 9 years of searching for answer that remain elusive. Margaret felt a strange mixture of fear and pity. If this truly was the spirit of Don Ramirez, then he was trapped in a kind of existence she couldn't imagine, aware and conscious, but cut off from all the things that made life meaningful. Maybe we could help, she heard herself saying, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Don Ramirez's head snapped toward her with sudden intensity. Help, he repeated, and for the first time, there was something like hope in his voice. You would do that, even knowing what I am. We could try, Margaret said, though she wasn't sure how 3 children could possibly assist a spirit in finding peace. But first, James interjected, his practical nature asserting self. We need to know more. About how you died, about what might be keeping you here. We need to understand the mystery before we can solve it. Don Ramirez nodded slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years of solitude and frustration. Yes, he said, it is time someone knew the truth. Time. Someone learned the secret that has kept me bound to this world of shadows and regret. Don Ramirez gestured toward the mansion with one pale, elongated hand. Come, he said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of command and invitation. If you truly wish to help, then you must know the full truth of what transpired in these halls. But I warn you, some knowledge once gained cannot be forgotten. Margaret looked at her 2 remaining companions. Tommy's face was pale as milk, but he nodded grimly. James pushed his spectacles up his nose, his curiosity clearly warring with his fear. After a moment's hesitation, all 3 children followed the spectral figure up the marble steps and into the mansion. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than Tommy remembered. The air seemed thick and heavy, as if weighted down by years of sorrow and secrets. Don Ramirez moved through the foyer with the familiarity of long residence, his form seeming to absorb rather than reflect the dusty shafts of sunlight that filtered through the grimy window. "Me study," he said, leading them toward a door beneath the grand staircase. It was there that my mortal life ended, and my current existence began. The study was a large, book-lined room that had once been the heart of Don Ramirez's business empire. A massive mahogany desk, dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with papers that had yellowed with age. Behind it, tall windows looked out onto the overgrown garden, their heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon light. He was a man of considerable wealth and influence. Don Ramirez began, settling into the chair behind his desk with a sigh that seemed to echo from beyond the grave. My shipping company controlled much of the trade between St. Augustine and the Caribbean. He had everything a man could desire: money, power, respect. He paused, his dark eyes growing distant. But I also had enemies, men who coveted what I had built, who resented my success. Chief among them was Cornelius Blackwood, a rival merchant who had tried for years to undermine my business. James leaned forward, his analytical mind already working. Did he have something to do with your death? In a manner of speaking, Don Ramirez replied. But the truth is far more complex than simple murder. You see, Blackwood had discovered something about me, something I had kept hidden for many years. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of secret? Don Ramirez was quiet for a long moment, his translucent fingers drumming silently on the desk surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was not the man I appeared to be. The Don Eduardo Ramirez who built this shipping empire, who married into one of St. Augustine's oldest families, who was respected throughout the community. That man was a fix. Tommy swallowed hard. What do you mean? My real name was Eduardo Morales. The spirit continued. I was born in Cuba to a family of modest means. When I was 20 years old, I came to Florida with nothing but ambition and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to succeed. He stood to a portrait on the wall, a painting of a distinguished gentleman in formal dress. The real Don Eduardo Ramirez was a young man of good family who had come to St. Augustine to establish a branch of his father's business. He was alone, friendless, and vulnerable. It was not difficult to arrange his disappearance. The children stared at him in horror. Margaret found her voice first. You killed him? I took his identity. Don Ramirez corrected, though the distinction seemed meaningless. His papers, his credentials, his very life. He became him so completely that even I sometimes forgot who I had been before. James felt sick to his stomach. And Blackwood found out? Blackwood had been investigating my background for months, trying to find some leverage he could use against me. He discovered records in Cuba, traced my real family, uncovered the truth about what had happened to the real Don Eduardo Ramirez. Don Ramirez stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the garden, where shadows were beginning to lengthen. He came to me on the night of my death, with documents, witnesses, proof of my deception. He demanded that I sign over half my business to him, or he would expose me to the authorities. But you refused, Margaret said, beginning to understand. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to simply hand over my life's work to a blackmailer. Don Ramirez replied. So I made him a different offer. I told him I would pay him a substantial sum, enough to set him up in business elsewhere, if he would destroy the evidence and never speak of it again. Tommy was beginning to see where the story was leading. But something went wrong. Blackwood was greedy, Don Ramirez said, his voice hardening. He took my money, but he kept copies of the documents. He said he would be back for more, that I would pay him for the rest of my life or face exposure and ruin. The spirit turned back to face the children, and they could see something like anguish in his dark eyes. I realized then that I would never be free of him, that no matter how much I paid, how much I gave him, it would never be enough. He would bleed me dry and then destroy me anyway. So you killed him, James said quietly. I invited him back the following evening, ostensibly to negotiate new terms, Don Ramirez continued. But instead, I poisoned his wine, a rare toxin I had acquired during my years in the Caribbean trade, tasteless, odorless, and virtually undetectably. Margaret felt her stomach lurch. You murdered him. I eliminated a threat to everything I had built. Don Ramirez said defensively, but I had not counted on the poison's unusual properties. Tommy frowned. What do you mean? The toxin was derived from a plant used by certain Caribbean practitioners of personalities. Darrencas explained reluctantly. I thought it was simply a poison, but it carried with it a curse. As Blackwood died, he spoke words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. A curse had made to suffer, as he was suffering, to know the agony of a slow death for all eternity. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. The children struggled to process what they had heard, a tale of murder, deception, and supernatural vengeance that seemed to belong in a Gothic novel rather than their own lives. The poison began to affect me within hours. Don Ramirez continued, but instead of dying as Blackwood had, I found myself trapped between life and death. My body aged and withered, but my consciousness remained. I became what you see before you, neither alive nor truly dead, bound to this place by the weight of my crimes. James cleared his throat nervously. What happened to Blackwood's body? Don Ramirez pointed to a section of the study's wooden floor. Beneath those boards lies a small cellar that I had constructed for storing valuable documents. It became his tomb. Margaret felt a wave of revulsion wash over her. He's still down there? His remains. Yes, Don Ramirez confirmed, along with the evidence he had gathered against me. I thought that by hiding his body and the documents, I could escape the consequences of my actions. But the curse that binds me here seems to demand a different kind of justice. Tommy was beginning to understand. You think that's why you can't move on? Because of what you did to Blackwood. I have spent 9 years searching for another explanation, Don Ramirez replied. But I always return to the same conclusion. I am trapped here by my own guilt, by the weight of a life built on lies and murder. Until I face the consequences of my actions, until justice is served, I will remain in this twilight existence. The children exchanged glances, each of them grappling with the moral complexity of the situation. They had come seeking adventure, and found themselves confronted with a tale of genuine evil and supernatural punishment. What kind of justice? Margaret asked. Finally, what would it take to free you? Don Ramirez looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. I believe, he said slowly, that the truth must be revealed. Blackwood's body must be found, his murder exposed. I must face the judgment of the living world for my crimes. James frowned. But if you confess to murder, won't you be, can a ghost be arrested? I do not know, Don Ramirez admitted. But I believe that the act of confession, of finally accepting responsibility for what I have done, may be enough to break the curse that binds me here. Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. You want us to help you confess to murder? I want you to help me find peace, Don Ramirez replied. For 9 years, I have been alone with my guilt and my secrets. You are the first living souls to hear my story, the first who might be able to help me make amends for my crime. Margaret looked around the study, imagining the terrible events that had taken place within its walls. Despite her fear and revulsion, she found herself moved by the spirit's obvious torment. If we help you, she said carefully, if we help you reveal the truth, what happens to us? Won't we be in trouble for knowing about a murder and not reporting it immediately? I will ensure that you are protected, Don Ramirez promised. He will make it clear that you discovered the truth innocently, that you acted with courage and honor in bringing it to light. The 3 children looked at each other, each weighing the risks and moral implications of what they were being asked to do. They were being offered the chance to help solve a decade-old murder, to bring justice to a victim who had been forgotten, and to free a tormented soul from an eternity of suffering. But they were also being asked to involve themselves in something far beyond their understanding, something that could have consequences they couldn't foresee. The study fell into an oppressive silence as the three children grappled with the weight of Don Ramirez's revelation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the grimy windows, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the normal sounds of St. Augustine life, carriages on cobblestones, children playing, merchants calling their wares. It seemed impossible that such ordinary life could continue while they sat in this room with a confessed murderous ghost. Margaret was the first to break the silence. "We need time to think about this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This isn't the kind of decision children should make alone." Don Ramirez nodded slowly, though disappointment flickered across his pale features. "I understand your reluctance. What I ask of you is no small thing. But consider this. Every day that passes is another day that Cornelius Blackwood remains unavenged. Another day that I remain trapped in this existence." James adjusted his spectacles nervously. "What if we told the authorities ourselves? What if we went to the police and told them what you've told us? Who would believe you?" Don Ramirez asked gently. "Three children, claiming to have spoken with a ghost about a murder that occurred 9 years ago? They would think you had been reading too many penny dreadfuls." Tommy, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "What about the evidence? You said Blackwood had documents, proof of your real identity. If those are still down there with his body, wouldn't that prove your story?" Don Ramirez's eyes brightened with something like hope. "Yes," he said eagerly. "The documents are there, along with other evidence of my crimes. If you could retrieve them, bring them to the authorities along with knowledge of where to find Blackwood's remains." "You want us to go down there?" Margaret interrupted, horrified. "Into a cellar with a dead body? The remains are old," Don Ramirez said, as if that made the prospect less terrifying. "Nothing more than bones and dust after all these years. And I would be with you to guide and protect you." James felt his scientific curiosity warring with his very reasonable fear. "How do we even know the cellar is still accessible? It's been 9 years. Don Ramirez moved to the section of floor he had indicated earlier and knelt down, his ghostly form seeming to merge with the shadows. "The entrance is here," he said, running his translucent fingers along what appeared to be a seamless section of wooden planking. "Hidden, but not sealed. I have checked it many times over the years." As he spoke, the children could see that what they had taken for solid flooring was actually a cleverly concealed trapdoor. The edges were nearly invisible, disguised by the natural grain of the wood and years of accumulated dust. "The documents are in a waterproof case," Don Ramirez continued. "They should be perfectly preserved. Along with them, you will find other evidence of my deception. Forged papers, stolen seals, correspondence that proves my true identity." Margaret felt torn between her natural sense of justice and her very reasonable fear of the situation they were being drawn into. "Even if we could retrieve the evidence," she said, "how do we explain how we found it? How do we tell the police about a hidden cellar without admitting we were trespassing in an abandoned house?" "You could say you were exploring," Tommy suggested. "Kids explore old buildings all the time. You could say you found the trapdoor by accident." "But then how do we explain knowing about the murder?" James pointed out. "If we just accidentally found evidence of a crime, why would we immediately know what it meant?" Don Ramirez had been listening to their debate with growing agitation. "Please," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of desperation. "I have waited so long for someone who could help me. I cannot bear the thought of spending eternity in this limbo, knowing that justice remains undone." The children looked at each other, each seeing their own uncertainty reflected in the other's faces. They were being asked to make a decision that no child should have to make, to involve themselves in matters of life and death, justice and vengeance. It was Margaret who finally spoke. "We'll need to talk to our parents," she said firmly. "We can't do this alone." Don Ramirez's form seemed to flicker with distress. "Your parents will forbid it. They will think you are either lying or delusional. They will never allow you to help me." "Then maybe we shouldn't help you," Tommy said bluntly. Maybe there's a reason children aren't supposed to get involved in things like this. But what about justice? James asked quietly. What about Cornelius Blackwood? Doesn't he deserve to have his murder solved, even after all these years? Margaret felt the weight of moral responsibility settling on her shoulders. She thought about the man who had been killed in this very room, whose body had been hidden away like a shameful secret. She thought about his family, who might still be wondering what had happened to him. And she thought about Don Ramirez himself, trapped between worlds by his own guilt and the supernatural consequences of his crimes. There has to be another way, she said finally, some way to bring the truth to light without putting ourselves in danger. Don Ramirez was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. Perhaps, he said slowly, it would require great courage from all of you, and it would mean accepting that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, even when revealing them brings consequences. What do you mean? James asked. I mean that you could simply tell the truth, Don Ramirez replied. All of it. Tell your parents what you have seen and heard. Tell them about me, about my confession, about the evidence that lies beneath this floor. Let them decide what should be done. Tommy looked skeptical. You said yourself that no one would believe us. Adults might not believe in ghosts, Don Ramirez said, but they do believe in justice, and they believe in protecting children. If you tell them that you have discovered evidence of a crime, they will investigate, regardless of how you claim to have learned about it. Margaret felt a spark of hope. You mean we could tell them about the hidden cellar without necessarily mentioning you? You could say you found old documents while exploring, Don Ramirez suggested. Documents that suggested something terrible had happened here. Your parents would feel obligated to contact the authorities, and the truth would come to light through proper channels. James nodded slowly. That could work. We wouldn't be lying exactly. We would have found evidence of a crime. We just wouldn't mention all the details about how we learned to look for it. But what about you? Margaret asked Don Ramirez. If the truth comes out, if Blackwood's body is found and your crimes are exposed, what happens to you? Don Ramirez smiled, and for the first time since they had met him, the expression seemed genuinely peaceful. I do not know, he admitted. But I hope, that facing the consequences of my actions will finally allow me to find rest. Whether that means moving on to whatever comes after death, or simply ceasing to exist, it must be better than this eternal twilight. The children exchanged glances, and Margaret could see that they had reached a consensus. It wasn't a perfect plan, and it carried risks they couldn't fully anticipate. But it offered a path forward that honored both justice and their own safety. All right, Margaret said finally. We'll help you, but we do this our way, with our parents' knowledge and the proper authorities involved. Don Ramirez bowed his head in gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. You cannot know what this means to me. Tommy looked around the study one more time, trying to imagine the terrible events that had taken place within its walls. When do we do this? When do we tell our parents? Tonight, Margaret decided. We go home. We tell our families what we've discovered, and we let them handle it from there. And if they don't believe us? James asked. Margaret looked at Don Ramirez, who nodded encouragingly. Then we bring them here, she said. We show them the trapdoor. We help them find the evidence. One way or another, the truth is going to come out. As if summoned by her words, the sound of the front door creaking open echoed through the mansion. The children froze, listening as footsteps, real, solid footsteps, approached the study. Margaret, Tommy, James, called a familiar voice. Are you children in here? It was Margaret's father, Dr. Patrick O'Sullivan, and he sounded both worried and angry. Behind his voice, they could hear others, the parents, who had apparently come looking for them when they failed to return home for dinner. Don Ramirez looked at the children with something like amusement. It seems, he said softly, that the decision has been made for you. The truth will come out tonight, whether you are ready or not." The study door burst open, and Dr. O'Sullivan strode in, followed by the other parents. They stopped short when they saw their children standing in the dusty room, apparently alone, but clearly shaken by something. "What are you doing here?" Dr. O'Sullivan demanded. "This place is dangerous. The floors could collapse. There could be wild animals or vagrants." Margaret looked at her father, then at Don Ramirez, who stood silently beside the desk, invisible to adult eyes. She took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. "Dad," she said quietly, "we need to tell you something. Something important. Something about this house and what happened here." O'Sullivan's stern expression softened slightly as he saw the genuine distress on his daughter's face. Behind him, the other parents, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, Professor Fletcher, and Mr. Kowalski, crowded into the study, their faces showing a mixture of relief at finding their children safe and anger at their disobedience. "Margaret, what's gotten into you?" Dr. O'Sullivan asked, his voice gentler now. "You've been gone for hours. We were worried sick." Margaret glanced at Don Ramirez, who stood silently beside his desk, visible only to the children. The spirit nodded encouragingly, his dark eyes reflecting both hope and resignation. "We found something, Dad," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something terrible." Professor Fletcher, James's father, adjusted his own spectacles and looked around the dusty study with academic interest. "What kind of something?" "Historical artifacts. Documents." "A crime," Tommy blurted out, unable to contain himself any longer. "We found evidence of a murder." The adults exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from concern to skepticism. Mrs. Brennan, Tommy's mother, stepped forward and placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "Tommy, you've been reading too many adventure stories," she said gently. "This is just an old house. Yuri Manyasinian is running away with you." "No, it's not," James protested, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "We really did find something. There's a hidden cellar under this floor, and there are documents down there that prove..." "Prove what?" O'Sullivan interrupted, his medical training making him skeptical of his children's dramatic claims. Margaret took a deep breath and pointed to the section of floor where Don Ramirez had shown them the concealed trapdoor. "There's a hidden entrance right there. If you look closely, you can see the outline of a door in the floorboards." The adults followed her gaze, and Professor Fletcher knelt down to examine the area she had indicated. After a moment, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, running his fingers along the nearly invisible seams. "There is something here. It's expertly concealed, but these boards definitely form some kind of access panel." O'Sullivan joined his colleague on the floor, and together they traced the outline of what was clearly a carefully constructed trapdoor. The other parents gathered around, their skepticism beginning to give way to curiosity. "How did your children notice this?" Miss Kowalski asked, his accent thick with suspicion. "It's almost impossible to see unless you know exactly where to look." Margaret felt her heart racing. This was the moment of truth, literally. She looked at Don Ramirez again, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. "We were exploring the house," she said carefully, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "Tommy dared us to come inside, and we were looking around when we noticed something odd about this section of floor. When we examined it more closely, we realized it was some kind of hidden door." "And you think there's evidence of a crime down there?" Mrs. Brennan asked, her voice still skeptical. "We didn't go down," James said quickly. "We were too scared. But we could see that there was a space underneath, and we thought we saw some kind of container or box." Professor Fletcher was already working at the edges of the trapdoor, trying to find a way to open it. "There must be some kind of mechanism," he muttered. "Ah, here we go." He pressed against a particular section of the wood, and with a soft click, the trapdoor swung open on hidden hinges. A mushy, stale odor wafted up from the darkness below, making several of the adults step back in disgust. Dr. O'Sullivan produced a small electric torch from his medical bag and shone it down into the opening. The beam revealed a small, brick-lined cellar about 6 feet square and perhaps 4 feet deep. In one corner sat a metal document case, green with age but still intact, and scattered around the floor. "Dear God," Dr. O'Sullivan whispered, his face pale in the torchlight. "Those are human remains." The adults recoiled from the opening, and Mrs. Brennan quickly pulled Tommy away from the side. But the children had already seen what lay in the hidden cellar, the yellowed bones of a human skeleton, still partially clothed in the rotted remains of what had once been an expensive suit. "We need to contact the police immediately," Professor Fletcher said, his academic composure shaken. "This is clearly a crime scene. But how did you children know to look here?" Mr. Kowalski pressed, his suspicion returning. "This trap door was expertly hidden. You couldn't have found it by accident." Margaret felt trapped between the truth and the need to protect her family from something they wouldn't understand. She looked desperately at Don Ramirez, who had been watching the proceedings with growing agitation. Suddenly, the spirit stepped forward, his form becoming more solid and visible than it had been before. "Tell them," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Tell them everything." To Margaret's amazement, several of the adults turned toward the sound of his voice, their faces showing confusion and alarm. "Did you hear that?" Dr. O'Sullivan asked, looking around the room. Someone spoke. Don Ramirez seemed to be drawing on some reserve of supernatural energy, making himself visible to the adults through sheer force of will. Slowly, his form began to materialize before their eyes, first as a vague shadow, then as a translucent figure, and finally, as the pale-gowned spectre the children had been seeing all along. Mrs. Brennan screamed and fainted dead away. Kowalski crosses himself and began muttering prayers in Polish. Professor Fletcher stared in fascination, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Only Dr. O'Sullivan seemed to maintain any semblance of composure, though his face had gone white as his medical bag. "My name," Don Ramirez said, his voice now audible to all present, "is Eduardo Morales, though I have spent the last 30 years of my existence calling myself Don Eduardo Ramirez. I am the man who murdered Cornelius Blackwood and hid his body in this cellar. And I am the reason these brave children have discovered the truth." The truth. The study erupted in chaos. Mr. Kowalski grabbed his remaining son and tried to flee, only to find his legs wouldn't carry him. Professor Fletcher began asking rapid-fire questions about the nature of spectral manifestation. O'Sullivan knelt beside his unconscious colleague, checking her pulses while keeping one eye on the ghost. "Please," Don Ramirez said, raising his hands for silence. "I know this is difficult to accept, but these children have done nothing wrong. They came here innocently, and I chose to reveal myself to them because I could no longer bear the weight of my crimes." "You're dead," Dr. O'Sullivan said bluntly, his medical training asserting itself. "The dead don't speak to the living." "Normally, no," Don Ramirez agreed. "But I've been trapped between life and death for 9 years, bound to this place by guilt and supernatural forces I do not fully understand. These children offered to help me find peace by bringing my crimes to light." Margaret found her voice at last. "He told us everything, Dad. About how he stole another man's identity, about how he killed Mr. Blackwood to keep his secret. He wants to confess, to face justice for what he did." Professor Fletcher, his academic curiosity overcoming his fear, stepped closer to the apparition. "This is extraordinary," he breathed. "A genuine supernal manifestation, with apparent consciousness and memory intact. The implications for our understanding of life after death are staggering. The implications for criminal justice are more immediate," Dr. O'Sullivan said dryly, though he too seemed fascinated despite himself. "If what you're saying is true, then we have a confession to a murder that occurred 9 years ago." Don Ramirez nodded gravely. "The evidence is all there," he said. pointing to the Tobit case in the cell. Blackwood's papers proving my deception, correspondence showing his attempts at blackmail, even the poison I used to kill him. Everything needed to prove my guilt and give that poor man the justice he deserves. Mrs. Brennan was beginning to stir, and Dr. O'Sullivan helped to a sitting position. She looked around the room in confusion, then saw Don Ramirez and promptly fainted again. "We need to contact the authorities," Dr. O'Sullivan said firmly. "Police, coroner, probably the district attorney. This is going to cause quite a sensation." "What about us?" Tommy asked nervously. "Are we going to get in trouble?" Don Ramirez turned to the boy with something like affection. "You have done nothing but show courage and compassion," he said. "I will ensure that the authorities understand you acted with honor throughout this ordeal." Professor Fletcher was already making notes in a small journal he had produced from his pocket. "This will revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, of the survival of personality after death. We must document everything. First things first," Dr. O'Sullivan said, taking charge of the situation. "Mr. Kowalski, can you take the children outside while we secure this scene? Professor Fletcher will need to contact the police and the coroner's office, and someone needs to figure out how to explain all this without sounding completely insane." As the adults began organizing their response to the unprecedented situation, Margaret looked at Don Ramirez one last time. The spirit's form was already beginning to fade, as if the effort of manifesting himself to the adults had drained his supernatural energy. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audibly. "You have given me the greatest gift possibly, the chance to make amends for my crimes." "What happens to you now?" Margaret asked softly. Don Ramirez smiled, and for the first time since they had met him, the expression was genuinely peaceful. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I am no longer afraid to find out." As the children were led from the study, Margaret looked back to see the ghost of Don Eduardo Ramirez standing beside his desk. One last time. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, and in its golden light, the spirit seemed to be dissolving like morning mist. By the time the police arrived an hour later, there was no trace of the supernatural presence that had haunted the mansion for 9 years. But the evidence of his crimes remained. The bones of Cornelius Blackwood, the documents proving Eduardo Morales' deception, and the testimony of 5 children who had helped a tormented soul find peace at last. The case of the Ramirez mansion murder would become one of Augustine's most famous mysteries, not just for the crime itself, but for the extraordinary circumstances of its solution. And though the adults would spend years debating the reality of what they had witnessed, the children never doubted the truth of their encounter with the ghost of Don Eduardo Ramirez. 3 months later, Margaret O'Sullivan sat on the front steps of her family's house on George Street, reading the latest newspaper account of what the press had dubbed the Phantom Confession case. The story had captured the imagination of the entire country, with reporters and curiosity seekers flocking to Augustine to see the mansion where a ghost had allegedly solved his own murder. The official investigation had confirmed everything Don Ramirez had told them. The remains in the cellar were indeed those of Cornelius Blackwood, a merchant who had disappeared. The documents found with his body proved that the man known as Don Eduardo Ramirez was actually Eduardo Morales, a Cuban immigrant who had assumed a false identity after murdering the real Ramirez heir. The poison bottle, still containing traces of the exotic toxin, had been analyzed by chemists who confirmed its Caribbean origin and deadly property. Most remarkably, they had also detected traces of what one expert described as unknown organic compounds with properties that defy current scientific understanding, substances that might explain the supernatural curse that had bound Eduardo Morales to the mansion. Tommy Brennan approached from down the street, his face still bearing the serious expression that had replaced his usual carefree grin since their encounter with the ghost. Behind him came James Fletcher, carrying a thick notebook filled with his detailed observations of their supernatural experience. "Any news about the mansion?" Tommy asked, settling beside Margaret on the steps. "They're finally going to tear it down," Margaret replied, folding the newspaper. The city council decided it's too dangerous to leave standing, and no one wants to buy a house where a murder was committed. James adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Do you think he's really at peace now? Don Ramirez, I mean. Margaret considered the question carefully. In the weeks following their revelation, she had returned to the mansion several times with her father and the other investigating officials. The building had felt different, empty in a way that went beyond mere abandonment. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the place like a shroud was gone, replaced by the simple sadness of a house that had outlived its purpose. I think so, she said finally. I think telling the truth, facing the consequences of what he did, that's what he needed to find peace. The Kowalski twins appeared around the corner, walking in their usual asynchronized manner. Peter and Paul had been the most affected by their encounter with the supernatural. Having fled in terror before hearing Don Ramirez's full confession, they had struggled to understand how their friends could have stayed to help a confessed murderer, even a dead one. The newspaper says they're going to put up a memorial for Mr. Blackwood, Paul said as they joined the group, in the square where the mansion used to be. That's good, Margaret said. He deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim. James had been quiet, scribbling notes in his journal. Now he looked up with the intense expression that meant he was working through a complex problem. I've been thinking about what Professor Fletcher said, he announced, about consciousness surviving death, about the implications for science and philosophy. And Tommy prompted, well, if Don Ramirez could remain conscious after death because of guilt and supernatural forces, what does that say about the nature of the soul? About justice and redemption? Margaret smiled at her friend's earnest intellectualism. I think it says that some things are more important than death. Truth, justice, making amends for the harm we've caused. Maybe those things are so fundamental that they can keep a person anchored to this world until they're resolved. Peter Kowalski, who rarely spoke, surprised them all by offering his own perspective. My grandmother always said that the dead can't rest until their business is finished. Maybe that's what we helped him do, finish his business. The five friends sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the familiar life of St. Augustine unfold around them. Carriages rattled over the cobblestones, merchants called their wares, and children played in the narrow streets, much as they themselves had done just months before. But they all felt changed by their experience, aged beyond their years by their encounter with genuine evil and supernatural justice. Do you think we'll ever see anything like that again? Tommy asked. Eventually, I hope not, Margaret said with feeling. Once in a lifetime is enough for me. But even as she spoke, she found herself scanning the shadows between buildings, watching for signs of movement that couldn't be explained by natural causes. Their encounter with Don Ramirez had opened their eyes to possibilities they had never imagined, to the idea that the world contained mysteries far deeper and more complex than they had ever suspected. James closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Whatever happens, he said, we'll face it together. That's what friends do. The others nodded in agreement, and Margaret felt a warm sense of satisfaction settle over her. They had been tested by circumstances beyond their understanding, and they had emerged stronger for it. They had helped a tormented soul find peace, brought justice to a forgotten victim, and learned that courage and compassion could triumph even over death itself. As the sun began to set over the ancient city, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, the five friends made their way home to families who still struggled to understand what their children had experienced. But the children themselves carried no doubts about the reality of their encounter or the importance of what they had accomplished. In helping Don Eduardo Ramirez, or Eduardo Morales, confess his crimes and face the consequences of his actions, they had learned lessons about justice, redemption, and the power of truth that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that some mysteries were meant to be solved, some secrets were too dangerous to keep, and some souls could find peace only through the courage and compassion of the living. The mansion where it all began was gone now, reduced to rubble and memory, but the lessons learned within its haunted walls would endure, carried forward by 5 children who had looked into the face of supernatural justice and helped it find its way home. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the shadows grew long and the air grew still, Margaret O'Sullivan would pause in whatever she was doing and listen carefully to the silence around her. Not because she expected to hear the voice of Don Eduardo Ramirez again. She was certain he had found his peace at last, but because she had learned that the world was full of voices waiting to be heard, stories waiting to be told, and truths waiting to be revealed. She had learned that being an expert in courage meant being ready to listen when those voices called, and being brave enough to act when action was needed. It was a lesson that would serve her well in the years to come, as she grew from a curious child into a woman who understood that some mysteries were too important to ignore, and some truths were too powerful to remain hidden forever. The ghost of Don Eduardo Ramirez had found his peace, but the legacy of his confession and the courage of 5 children who helped him find redemption would echo through the streets of St. Augustine for generations to come.